Last week, I served as a juror in a murder trial, and I'd like to take advantage of this first-time opportunity for me to share what the experience is like for a Christian to be as a juror in a trial such as this, and how that relates to the Christian's use of power and involvement in the structures of power in society. Welcome to Thinking Wisely with Dr. Isley, where we learn to live wisely by thinking wisely. As I said, I was chosen to be one of the jurors in a murder trial last week. And fortunately, I will say it was not a difficult case in the sense that there was no doubt about the killing having been committed. It was of a person in jail, a convict in jail, actually killing another convict. So there was no question about whether he did it or not. It's really about the level of guilt, whether it was he was guilty of second degree murder with intent, as the state and the prosecutors wanted to have, or was it some lesser crime, as second degree murder, uh, reckless, voluntary manslaughter, or involuntary manslaughter with recklessness. And so it was helpful that we didn't have to decide who did it, but we had to see, did the state prove its case that this person had committed this crime with the intent of murdering or killing the other person? And let me just add that I was very impressed with the lawyers and the judge. They handled things professionally and were very competent. And I was impressed with the jurors as well, that nobody was pushing a private agenda at all. We all looked at the evidence and actually came quickly to a conclusion that the state had not proven its case, but that it would seem from the evidence that we had that this man had murdered or killed another man uh, in a fit of anger, out of control, without consideration for the consequences, perhaps. So it was involuntary manslaughter with recklessness. So that's kind of what a summation of what went on, and it lasted for 4 days. What I'd like to think about, though, is my reactions as a Christian in this. So after I was chosen, um, sitting there, and the young man comes in, and the accused, with his lawyer, and he was a young man, about 19, and sat down, and immediately as a Christian, I go, oh dear, this poor man. It would be great to be merciful to him. And you saw his family behind him. But then in the back, we saw the family of the murdered man. And so then I have to say, well, what does it mean to be merciful here? And I had to put aside the desire that no one would suffer because a crime had been committed. There needed to be some sort of punishment. And it also, I struggled with the fact that here you had a young man, a black man. Uh, his life, already had gone wrong, and it seemed to be going worse. And I was going to be some way committing him to a sentence in prison longer than what he was going to serve. And it also troubled me to see that three of the witnesses were other convicts, and two of those were black. So you have three of the four people involved were blacks. And I struggle, what is going on here? Why are there so many African Americans here? And I also struggled with the one white witness from the jail, a convict, who really seemed not, frankly, not very intelligent. And yet all of these men, for different reasons, were in jail. And I wondered about our society and what has been done or what should have been done for these men. But once again, I had to think, what is my role here? My role is not to solve society's problems. My role is not certainly to deal with issues perhaps of racism or lack of education, etc. My role here as a citizen was to decide, was this man guilty of what he was charged? Or was there a lesser crime committed? And I really had to say that was my limited role in this, as was the other jurors. We were limited by the law and what we were assigned to do. So there is that sense in which, okay, we have to realize that maybe we can't solve everything every time. But the other thing that struck me was I'm exerting power over this young man who'd committed the crime. I, by my choice and that of the other jurors, would decide what his fate was, perhaps for the next several years. So this made me think about the issue of the Christian involved in power. And I wanted to add to this. So I watch things on YouTube and I'm involved in Facebook, as probably many of you are. And I have friends really on both sides of the political divide as far as what's called conservative and what's called liberal or progressive in this day and age, and maybe even more extreme on both sides. But one of the things that I've been troubled by is that some of my friends, usually more on what might be called the progressive side, not necessarily with their theology, but with their political views, um, really saying the church is caught up in the worship of power now. And I think it's because of many church members, and particularly in the evangelical church where I'm a member, or evangelical churches of which I'm a member of one, uh, many supported Donald Trump's presidency and voted for him. And I think, they get accused of Christian nationalism or they get accused of trying to force their faith on others and being enraptured with power. Well, my purpose here isn't to, shall I say, um, argue about the various virtues or the favorable status of different political views. It's the issue of power. And I do think that it's a false charge, largely false, about Christians being exalted, loving, exalting power, and really wanting to exercise it. And perhaps, for the most part, now I know there are some who are saying, but we want to form a Christian nation, get back to our roots in that sense. And I really don't see that in most of my experience, although you can find it on the internet. And I'm afraid that many of these criticisms about Christians involved in power um, actually probably are thinking more of these radical things that come out on the internet rather than in most of our local churches. I certainly don't see it, and I haven't seen it in the other churches that I've been involved in. Now, what I would like to say though is we need to reflect upon power. And some of the critics of the Christians, I think, at this time, particularly those maybe who had supported more right-wing political policies, they talk like it's this love of power. And they sound somewhat like, and I'll get back to this in a bit, the Anabaptist view of involvement in society. But let me just say that as a juror, I was exercising power in a secular organization, the court system, over another person. When um, we vote, we are exercising not just our right, which it is in America, but it's also exerting power. You see, government is power. It is to rule. That's what it does. And so when I vote, I'm saying I want this to be done in the policy and practice of my city, state, or federal government. I want public schools to be strongly supported. So then somebody that doesn't believe in that has to pay taxes towards something they don't believe in. Or perhaps you might have another case, just of public parks, and people want various features in a public park. And so taxes need to be raised for that. And if I'm in favor of those things, that means somebody is going to be taxed for that maybe doesn't support it or even doesn't want to support it. And maybe their life is hindered somewhat by the taxation that goes to support a lot of programs. So we shouldn't fool ourselves that we're not involved in power and its structures when we act as ordinary citizens with our responsibilities, whether it's voting or whether it's serving on a jury. And for those that seem to think that we shouldn't do that or seem to accuse Christians of a more right-wing side, and I'm really not here to defend either side on as far as the political side goes, but to accuse them of being power hungry. I think they're mistaken, and a lot of their arguments, when I read them, sound Anabaptist. Now, let me just explain what that is. Anabaptism was a movement in the 16th century that was outside of the Catholic Church, outside of the Lutheran and Reformed and Anglican churches. And they suffered greatly for it. And out of the Anabaptist movement came Mennonites, Amish, etc. But I'd like to read some of the Schleitheim Confession from 1527 that the Anabaptists put together. And it's on the issue of separation, which is point 4. Here's what they say. A separation shall be made from the evil and from the wickedness which dwell planted in the world. From this, we should learn that everything which is not united with our God in Christ cannot be other than an abomination which we should shun and flee. By this is meant, listen to this, all civic affairs, the oaths sworn in unbelief, and other things of that kind, which are highly regarded by the world, and yet are carried on in the flat contradiction to the command of God. And then as they talk about the use of the sword, and now the sword here doesn't mean just like in military, in the army or something where you're having to fight, etc., although it includes that. But it also is just the use of force in society, which is what government does. And so it will be asked concerning the sword, shall one be a magistrate, a ruler in this sense, if one should be chosen as such? This is a Christian. Should they be a magistrate? The answer is as follows. Also, he, Christ himself, forbids the employment of the force of the sword. And finally, it is not appropriate for a Christian to serve as a magistrate because they exercise the sword, political power, and forcing others to do things that they might not want to do. Even in my case as a juror, I was going against the Anabaptist teaching about the use of power. I was not to be involved in that. I swore an oath to follow the instructions that I was given. That also was against the Anabaptist thought. So much needs to be thought, and I think, and in a much better spirit, concerning Christians' involvement in society, which is always going to have the case of being involved in the use of power, whether it's voting, whether it's serving in the jury, whether it's being a police officer, a judge, a politician, or a member of the armed services. We need to think about these things. We need to think about them biblically, and we need to discuss them civilly as Christians are commanded to do. Thank you for listening. If you want to subscribe to these videos, please click on the icon at the bottom, and your comments are always welcome. Thank you.